How do you see this negative notion that some people spread that all the private schools constitute a one single mafia and they only fleece money? How far is it true, or is it that there are some schools that might be wanting in certain terms and generally these schools have a role?
Well, perception is always not reality. What perceptions the public has about private schools, or what perception the private schools have about the FFRC, they are not reality.
Before I start my conversation with Justice Retired Sunil Hali, FFRC Chairman J&K, I just want to put the things in perspective. It was in year 2013 that the government constituted a committee to regulate the fee structure of the private schools working in this territory. But unfortunately, in the next year, 2014, Kashmir was hit by terrible floods. Like any other infrastructure, individual or collective, schools had their own share of loss. In the subsequent years, Kashmir witnessed another major disruption that resulted in the loss of education months, and consequently there was loss of revenue to the schools also, and the education of our children suffered once again. Then came the major disruption in the form of COVID-19. During the COVID-19, there was a prolonged closure of our schools, and then there were questions raised. Since the economy of most of the people got affected during COVID-19, there were demands that there should be some concession in the fee that the parents pay to the schools, because schools couldn't operate and the income of the people got affected. So this was the context of the FFRC and the schools entering into a relationship that was seen then unpleasant, if not hostile. Now, as a consequence of this, two parallel, if not contradictory perspectives or approaches are framing up. One, the private schools. They seem to see FFRC as severe, as strict, and maybe disabling. They find this regulatory regime as making things difficult for the schools. Now talk to FFRC or the people who want that there must be regulations for all the institutions and schools as well. They say that the schools are not forthcoming, they're not transparent, they don't have the required systems and processes in place, and they must do it sooner the better. In this kind of an atmosphere, if the things are not ironed out, if there is no conversation between private schools, between the parents and the regulator, it seems that there is a likelihood of things not turning out good for our education. This is the reason that we at Thinksite, we are trying to develop a conversation among different stakeholders, parents, the people in general, government departments, and the schools, all with one purpose, that is the education of our children. With these words, I welcome Justice Retired Sunil Hali to this conversation. Thank you, sir, for agreeing for this interview and sparing your time and taking this trouble of explaining the things to not just to the private schools, but to the public. If I can begin with a mild and a soft question, but a thematic one. I just was going through one of the orders that you recently passed. I could sense that the understanding of the FFRC about the private schools is that we do require them, these schools, they have a role to play. How do you see this negative notion that some people spread that all the private schools constitute a one single mafia and they only fleece money? How far is it true, or is it that there are some schools that might be wanting in certain terms and generally these schools have a role?
Well, perception is always not reality. What perceptions the public has about private schools, or what perception the private schools have about the FFRC, they are not reality. I'll give a little bit of his background why this regulatory body was constituted. In early 90s, there was a mushroom of growth of private institutions.
Right.
And they were charging fees at their own will, capitation fees, as you must be knowing.
Right.
Now, subsequently, Supreme Court intervened, and the famous judgment of TAPI Foundation case, they set out certain parameters that private schools, they have set down the functioning of the private schools. And the principal thing is that any private school which is established has a right to manage its affairs, and there will be no intervention in that. A private school has a right to determine what are its requirements, how his institution can become viable. After having said so, the Supreme Court also said that some regulation has to be established so that these private schools do not become a business enterprises. And there are various judgments, Islamic Foundation judgments. So it was only therefore found necessary that there should be a regulatory body which will regulate the fee structure of the private schools. Now, private schools have right to fix fees, but that is subject to the approval by the regulatory body. We can either approve that or change or lay down our own fee structure. Therefore, it is not something which is a sort of an intrusion into the working of a private school. It is more or less an effort to regulate. Because once you see, education you cannot compare with any other enterprise. Providing education is a public duty.
Right.
Since the government is unable to provide provide schooling to everybody, there are a number of schools which can absorb all the population.
True.
Therefore, incentive was given to the private schools to open, and private schools are also to perform a public duty in educating people at large. Therefore, to say that a regulatory body is somewhat fearsome or it is dictatorial is absolutely misconceived.
Right.
A perception that you say has been developed about that there is a perception that the schools being run by the private persons is a gang of mafia. This is absolutely misplaced. Absolutely misplaced. There is no such perception with the FFRC.
Good. So if I could, sir, understand this, one, that the people who run these schools, they must understand it is not a business in the normal sense. That is what the government is actually concerned about. As a matter of fact, constitutionally and legally, it is a matter of right for our children to get their education.
Yes.
So we have to see the establishment of schools in that framework, that this is not a business for profiteering, one, and second, it is a matter of right, and we are performing a duty that is societal in nature. But there is an underbelly to it. One, that if we consider, when people like a layman like me, we consider it as a not-for-profit activity, and we then fixed it in a charitable framework. But then there are services and there are resources that you have to put in to run a school. So that means that, as you say, that the regulatory body is not someone that defeats the purpose of schools. It does take into account the resources that you put into establishing a school and also the services that are needed. Am I right?
You're absolutely correct. See, there was no statutory flavor to this. Now, in 2022, and J&K Act was amended and new sections were introduced that. Thereafter, regulations were framed. After framing of regulations, everything is mentioned in the regulations how the fees has to be fixed. It's not that we fix out of nothing.
Right.
Rule 7 particularly provides the methodology how you have to assess it. Now, when you talk about, see, the Supreme Court says that this activity is occupation.
Yeah.
Occupation means somebody is occupied to earn his livelihood.
Right. Exactly.
So we cannot simply say that it is charitable. That means that you have to be charitable.
Exactly.
In literal sense, you have to be charitable. What it indicates is that the element of profiteering should not be there.
Good.
For running the school, for providing facilities, for paying salaries or paying to the management, whichever is running the school, The provisions are there already provided.
So it's a kind of a fresh breeze of life for those schools who are under this misperception that here is a regulator, it will not allow me to run the school. That means your message to them is that if the services are needed, if it is an occupation, if it's a side of occupation side also, regulator takes into account all these elements and allows the school to have a good financial health, to account for the services that go into it, and also the resources that are being employed to develop the infrastructure. So that message should go to the private schools, that you be forthcoming. If you have these schools, you come and regulator will take into account all these things.
See, once you establish a school, you need money.
Yeah.
You don't suddenly build a school out of nothing.
Right.
You invest money.
Exactly.
You build infrastructure. You provide facilities. That needs money. Now, what the regulation states. So you see, there is a proper way of assessing the fee structure. Whatever expenditure they have incurred, it is reflected in their audit reports, in their balance sheets. Whatever revenue receipts they have received, that is also reflected there. Now, on the basis of those factors, we consider as to whether this is payable or this is not payable.
Right.
These are properly, there is a statutory requirement that they should be audited by a chartered accountant. Everything is indicated. See, there are two aspects of it. One is tuition fees, the other is the annual fees.
Right.
Now, tuition fees exclusively must go towards the payment of salary to the teachers and some minor expenses.
Day-to-day expenses.
Annual fees is how maintenance. It relates only to the maintenance of the institution. What are the expenses incurred by the school in providing, say, for example, games, swimming, other activities. The laboratories been established, all other expenses which is not covered by tuition fees. So on that basis we assess that how much income they have generated, what is the expenditure. Now while analyzing that aspect, say for instance, I'll give you an example. The school, once established, it tries to put everything which is possible for running a school. Say for instance, they establish a computer lab. 100 computers are purchased by a school.
Right.
Now it costs about 10 lakhs. I'm just giving an example, 10 lakhs. Now what happens? When the next year they also file, they repeat the same thing.
Okay.
So same thing means, but this is one time investment. Yes, there are depreciation is there, that is accounted for. That is where the catch lies. That's where they feel that now the regulatory bodies trying to intervene.
Looking into these details.
Looking into details. Because we have to look into the details.
No, absolutely, you have to.
Because you see, whatever is been spent there, whatever are genuine expenses incurred by the school. I have had interaction with many schools, and many of the schools, I have visited many of the schools. I by and large found that their atmosphere is not, I found the infrastructure wise they are up to the mark. Whatever they have stated in their files, found in by and large it does exist on the spot. And there is one more reason, because they are all in sense of competition. They are in a race for each other. They want to outdo other. That is one aspect that is not relevant. So what we need to say that it is not something arbitrary exercise here. We don't arbitrarily decide things. We take into consideration everything. We take into consideration, yes, that school must have surplus funds, the tune of 15-20%. Surplus would mean actually the profit. But that also is to be...
But that has to be invested back into the school working. So the only difference here is for other normal businesses, it's your sweet will where to use that profit. But in case of a school, you have to use it on the educational enterprise back. So that is the cardinal difference here.